It all started with Ronald when we both turned 18. Back then, I was a close-headed gay guy who hadn't told anyone about my feelings or even fully processed them myself. Ronald was my best, and honestly my only friend. He was everything I admired: muscular, smart, charismatic, the guy everyone wanted to be around. He always seemed to have girls interested in him, and I couldn't blame them. I wasn't bad-looking myself, decent shape, nice enough features, but next to Ronald, I felt like I was always in his shadow. As I started to understand more about myself and my attraction to guys, it was like everything zeroed in on him. I couldn't help it. I was in love. Quietly, painfully. I wanted him every day, even though I knew it was impossible. I'd imagine him in ways I'd never imagine anyone else, and yeah, it was intense. Every time I had those moments alone, it was him I thought about. His strong hands, the curve of his jaw, the way his shirt would cling to his chest when he stretched. In my fantasies, it was always Ronald with me, touching me, wanting me back. But that's all it ever was, dreams. There was no way I'd risk ruining the friendship we had, no matter how badly I wanted more. It was a Friday night, and my dad had gone out for a weekend fishing trip with his friends. The house was ours, just me and Ronald. We didn't have any big plans, so we did what we always did when we hung out: talk trash about our high school classmates, played video games, and eventually cracked open a couple of beers. I remember thinking how perfect it felt, just the two of us, no one else around. Ronald had this way of being so at ease with himself. He sprawled on the couch, his legs stretched out like he owned the place. His confidence was magnetic. I'd always admired him for that, but that night it hit differently. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and sweatpants, nothing special, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. The way his shirt clung to his chest when he leaned forward to grab his beer, the curve of his bicep when he adjusted his seat, everything about him felt like it was designed to torment me. We were both a little tipsy, and the conversation had slowed. I could feel the quiet stretching between us, and my thoughts wandered, like they always did when I was around him. I imagined what it would be like to lean over and kiss him right there on the couch. To feel his lips on mine, to run my hands over his chest, to explore every inch of him. God, I wanted him so badly, but I knew I couldn't do anything. He was my best friend, my only real connection to someone who knew me, even if he didn't know all of me. I didn't want to ruin that. Still, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting. I thought about how his hair might feel between my fingers, or how his skin would smell up close. I wondered if he'd let me, just once, trace the lines of his muscles with my hands. I had to shake my head to snap out of it, but the alcohol wasn't helping. If anything, it made it worse because it dulled the part of my brain that usually kept me in check. We stayed up late, laughing at stupid memes and sharing stories we'd probably told each other 100 times before. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. My dad's old recliner had been his go-to crash spot for years, but this time, we set up 2 beds in my room. It felt weirdly comforting to have him there, close enough to hear him breathe, but far enough that I couldn't reach out and do something stupid. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts still racing. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I could hear Ronald shifting on his bed, the sound of his body against the sheets, and I imagined how warm he'd feel next to me. I wanted to turn over and look at him, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed still, letting my thoughts run wild until I finally drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and the air was heavy with the lingering smell of beer and whatever cheap cologne Ronald had sprayed on earlier. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I turned over to check the time on my phone. That's when I noticed movement from Ronald's bed. At first, I thought he was just shifting in his sleep, but then I saw the light of his phone screen illuminating his face. He wasn't just scrolling through Instagram or something casual. He was fully focused, his brows slightly furrowed, lips parted just a bit, and his hand, well, let's just say it wasn't resting idly. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. I didn't know what to do. Should I pretend I didn't see anything? Should I roll over and go back to sleep? But then, like an idiot, I found myself staring. It was like my brain had short-circuited, and I couldn't look away. He wasn't being loud or anything, just soft, quiet movements under the blanket. but I knew exactly what he was doing, and honestly, it drove me insane. The same guy I'd been dreaming about for years was right there, vulnerable, and for a split second, I wondered if he was thinking about someone in particular. Was it one of those girls he used to talk about? Or someone he'd hooked up with before? My stomach twisted at the thought, but at the same time, I couldn't stop watching. And then, without really thinking, I did something I never thought I'd have the guts to do. I slid out of my bed, moving as quietly as I could, and crept toward him. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it might explode, but I couldn't stop myself. When I got close enough, I reached out and grabbed his shoulder gently. He flinched and nearly dropped his phone, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and embarrassment. "Dude, what the hell?" he whispered, his voice low but panicked. I hesitated, my own face burning. I couldn't sleep, I mumbled, which was the lamest excuse I could have come up with. He stared at me, his face still lit by the glow of his phone. I don't know what made me say it, but the words just came out. "Do you want help?" For a moment, it felt like the entire world stopped. Ronald just stared at me, his mouth slightly open like he couldn't believe what I'd just said. I thought he was about to shove me away or tell me to get out, but instead, he blinked a few times and then he nodded. It was like my brain and body disconnected at that moment. Everything I'd imagined, everything I'd ever wanted, was suddenly right there in front of me. I slid under the blanket, my hands shaking as I moved closer to him. The warmth of his body was intoxicating, and when I reached out to touch him, I couldn't believe how real it felt. He didn't stop me. If anything, he seemed curious, like he wasn't sure what to expect but wasn't about to pull away either. And when I started to move my hands, exploring him, he let out this quiet, breathy sound that sent shivers down my spine. I remember being overwhelmed by how much bigger he was than me. I'd always known he was built, but this was different. Feeling it, being so close to him, it was like discovering a whole new side of him I'd only ever dreamed about. His breaths grew heavier, and his body shifted slightly as if he was trying to hold himself together. But then, just as I was completely lost in the moment, I thought I heard something. A faint noise, like the creak of a floorboard or the sound of someone moving in the house. My heart stopped and I froze, my eyes darting toward the door. "What's wrong?" Ronald whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did you hear that?" I whispered back. He frowned, clearly not as paranoid as I was, and shook his head. "You're imagining things. Just keep going." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just being overly cautious. So I ignored it and focused back on him, letting the world outside our little bubble fade away. But if I'd known what was about to happen, I might have thought twice. The night had an intensity I wasn't prepared for, and looking back, it feels like every second of it is etched into my memory. After that first bold move under the covers, something shifted between Ronald and me. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was the sheer closeness of it. The way his body tensed and then relaxed under my touch. The warmth radiating from him. The faint scent of his skin mixed with the lingering cologne he always wore. I was so focused on him, on everything about him, that I almost convinced myself we were in our own world. Just the two of us, free from judgment, free from any consequences. It was like every fantasy I'd ever had was suddenly a reality, but it wasn't rushed or messy like I might have imagined. It was natural, in a way. Ronald, for his part, was quieter than I expected. His breathing was deep, uneven, and every so often, I could feel his body jerk slightly as I explored him. He wasn't used to this, at least not like this, and that made it all the more surreal. I could tell he was holding himself back, trying to figure out how he felt about everything. And yet, he didn't stop me. He didn't pull away or push me off. If anything, there was this unspoken permission between us, this fragile understanding that we were both crossing into uncharted territory. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, and I kept thinking how surreal it was. This was my best friend, the guy I'd been hopelessly in love with for years. And now here I was, closer to him than I'd ever thought I'd be. The weight of it hit me in waves, but I couldn't stop myself. Every small reaction from him, his breathing, the way his muscles tensed under my hands, only made me want more. But then it happened. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the faintest sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart froze in my chest, and a wave of cold panic washed over me. My dad wasn't supposed to be home. He was supposed to be halfway to the lake with his fishing buddies, drinking cheap beer and telling old stories. But the noise was unmistakable. I stopped instantly, pulling back as quietly as I could. Ronald looked at me, confused, his expression clouded with a mix of frustration and concern. I put a finger to my lips, silently begging him to stay quiet. The next sound was even worse, the soft creak of the bathroom door opening just down the hall. My dad was home. I felt like the walls were closing in. Every possible scenario played out in my head in the span of a few seconds. What if he came to check on us? What if he opened the door right now? The panic was overwhelming, but I forced myself to keep still. After a few agonizing minutes of silence, I heard the bathroom door close again, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating toward his bedroom. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling with the adrenaline. Ronald just stared at me, his face pale, but there was something else there too, a flicker of excitement, like he couldn't believe we'd almost been caught. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Instead, we both got up, moving as quietly as possible. I motioned toward the bathroom, and Ronald followed me without a word. The bathroom was small, barely big enough for the two of us to stand in without bumping into each other. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the tiled walls. It wasn't exactly romantic, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Ronald leaned against the sink, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was a tension between us, thick and electric, and I didn't know what to say to break it, so I didn't. Instead, I reached for the shower handle and turned it on, the sound of rushing water filling the tiny space. We stepped into the shower together, the warm water cascading over us, washing away the remnants of the night so far. It was the closest we'd ever been, physically, emotionally. The barriers we'd kept up for so long were gone, and all that was left was us. I reached for him hesitantly, my fingers brushing against his chest, and when he didn't pull away, I let myself explore. The warmth of his skin, the way the water traced over the lines of his muscles, it was intoxicating. He met my gaze, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. We kissed. It wasn't perfect or practiced, it was messy and raw, but it was real. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the weight of him against me, solid and reassuring. The shower was small, and we kept bumping into the walls, but we didn't care. Every touch, every movement was a discovery, and I could feel the hesitation in him melting away with each passing second. And then, just when it felt like nothing could ruin the moment, the door opened. The sound of it swinging inward was enough to make both of us freeze, and when I turned, I saw the outline of my dad standing in the doorway. "Hey, you showering?" he asked, his voice casual, like he didn't notice what was happening. My brain short-circuited. "Yeah, Dad, just finishing up," I stammered, trying to sound normal even though my voice cracked. He lingered for a moment, probably wondering why I sounded so weird, but then he just shrugged. "All right, don't take too long," he said before closing the door again. The second the door shut, Ronald let out a quiet laugh, his body shaking with suppressed giggles. "That was insane," he whispered, his face lit up with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "I can't believe we almost got caught, twice." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and I couldn't believe how close we'd come to being discovered. But when I looked at Ronald, all I could think about was how he didn't seem to care. If anything, he looked happy, excited even. That night changed everything. The next morning was strange, to say the least. I woke up to the faint light of the sun creeping through the blinds, my head pounding slightly from the leftover effects of the beer. For a second, I thought it had all been a dream. The events of the previous night felt too surreal to be real. But then I turned my head, and there was Ronald, sprawled out on the other bed, his arm hanging lazily off the edge, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. It wasn't a dream. It had happened. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything. My mind was a mess of emotions, excitement, guilt, confusion, and a strange sort of satisfaction I couldn't quite put into words. The memory of the shower, of being that close to him, was burned into my brain, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wanted it again. Ronald eventually stirred, stretching his arms over his head and letting out a grubby groan. When he sat up, his hair was a mess, and he looked more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. But there was something different about him, something lighter. He didn't look uncomfortable or awkward. If anything, he looked curious. As the day went on, I noticed little changes in the way he acted around me. He wasn't distant or weird like I feared he might be. Instead, he seemed more relaxed, more open. He'd catch my eye and hold my gaze just a little longer than usual. He'd brush past me in the kitchen, his hand grazing mine for just a second longer than it needed to. It wasn't long before he brought up the previous night, casually, like it was no big deal. He admitted that he'd enjoyed it more than he thought he would. He said he'd never thought about anything like that before, not seriously, but now that it had happened, he couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no shame in his voice, no hesitation, just a raw honesty that made my chest ache in the best way. I could tell he was still figuring things out, trying to make sense of what it all meant for him. He didn't say he was gay or even bi, but he didn't say he wasn't either. It was like he was opening a door he'd never even noticed before, and I was the one holding it open for him. That night, it happened again. We were in my room, the door closed and locked this time, just in case. There was a tension in the air, the kind that made my skin buzz with anticipation. We didn't need to talk about it. We both knew why we were there, why we were sitting so close on the edge of my bed. This time, there was no hesitation. No alcohol to blur the edges, no excuses to hide behind. It was deliberate, intentional, and somehow even more intimate than before. Ronald was different this time, more confident, more sure of himself. He took the lead in ways I didn't expect, his hands exploring me with a curiosity that sent shivers down my spine. Every touch felt electric, every movement deliberate and careful. It was slow and unhurried, like we had all the time in the world. He traced the lines of my body with his hands, his touch firm but gentle, and I couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt. Like we were meant to fit together this way. When he kissed me, it was softer than I imagined. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, but it didn't matter. It was perfect. He tasted like toothpaste and something faintly sweet, and I couldn't get enough. We lost ourselves in each other, the rest of the world fading into the background. And then, just when I thought we were safe, it happened. The door to my room swung open without warning, and my dad was standing there, holding a plate of something, cookies, I think. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. The plate slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor and sending cookies scattering everywhere. His eyes were wide, his mouth hanging open as he stared at us. "What the hell?" he started, his voice breaking the heavy silence. I scrambled to sit up, pulling the blanket over us in a panic. Ronald froze, his face a mixture of horror and disbelief. My dad didn't say anything else. He just stared for a few seconds before quickly turning and muttering an awkward sorry. He left the room, closing the door behind him, and I could hear his footsteps retreating down the hall. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The shock of being caught was like a punch to the gut, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Ronald was the first to break the silence. "Well," he said, his voice tinged with nervous laughter, "that was something." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My dad had just walked in on us, and I had no idea how I was going to face him. But then I looked at Ronald, and despite everything, he was smiling. After that, things changed between us. We didn't talk about what happened with my dad right away, but we couldn't ignore the shift in our relationship. We were closer now, more comfortable with each other in ways we never had been before. Ronald started to lose the awkwardness he'd had at first, his confidence growing with every moment we spent together. It wasn't long before we started seeing each other in secret. We didn't label it, didn't talk about what it meant, but it didn't matter. We were happy, and that was enough. There were moments of pure exhilaration, like the time we snuck off during a free period at college and found ourselves in one of the bathroom stalls. The thrill of it, the risk, the excitement, was almost too much to handle. We kept quiet, our movements careful, but the intensity of it all made my head spin. A few days after everything that had happened, Ronald and I found ourselves in that strange, thrilling space where everything felt new and uncertain, but in the best way possible. We'd grown closer in ways I never thought possible, and yet there was still a layer of unspoken emotion between us, a kind of raw vulnerability that we were both still navigating. One evening, Ronald brought up an idea that caught me off guard. We were sitting in my room, just hanging out like we usually did, when he turned to me with that mischievous glint in his eye that always made my stomach flutter. "How about we get out of here for a night?" he asked casually, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness in his voice. I blinked at him. "What do you mean?" "A hotel. Just us. No interruptions, no worrying about anyone walking in on us. Somewhere we can just be." I was taken aback, not because I didn't want it, but because I hadn't expected him to suggest something like that. The thought of being alone with him, away from everything, made my heart race. I nodded, trying to play it cool, but inside, I was already picturing what it might be like. The day of our little getaway felt like an eternity in the making. Ronald had booked a room at a small, cozy hotel just outside of town, not too fancy, but nice enough to feel special. When we arrived, the evening sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything. We checked in without any fuss, and the moment we stepped into the room, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness settle over me. The room was simple but inviting, a large bed with crisp white sheets, a small sitting area by the window, and soft lighting that gave the space a warm, intimate feel. Ronald set our small bag down by the bed and turned to me with a grin. "What do you think?" "It's perfect," I said honestly, taking it all in. We opened a bottle of wine Ronald had brought along, pouring ourselves small glasses and settling onto the bed. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with him, but there was an underlying tension between us, an anticipation that neither of us acknowledged out loud. After a while, the wine loosened our nerves, and we found ourselves sitting closer, our legs brushing against each other. Ronald reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair away from my face, and I felt a shiver run down my spine at the simple gesture. "You're something else, you know that," he murmured, his voice low and warm. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled, my cheeks flushing under his gaze. And then he leaned in, his lips finding the curve of my neck. The sensation was immediate. A rush of heat that spread through me, leaving me breathless. His kisses were slow and deliberate, each one sending a new wave of warmth coursing through my veins. I tilted my head slightly, giving him more access, and he took full advantage, his lips trailing a path down to my collarbone. His hands rested on my sides, firm but gentle, and I could feel the strength in them as he pulled me closer. He took his time, his kisses moving lower, brushing over my chest and the faint definition of my abs. Each touch, each kiss was deliberate, almost reverent, and it made my chest tighten with emotion. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, the way his lips lingered just long enough to leave a faint tinkle behind. My breathing grew heavier, my chest rising and falling as I tried to process the overwhelming sensations. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, intimate and tender, but with an intensity that made my pulse race. "Relax," he whispered against my skin, his voice soft and soothing. And I did. He guided me gently, his hands steady and reassuring, until I was lying on my stomach. The vulnerability of the position made my heart race, but Ronald was patient, his touch never faltering. He ran his hands down my back, the warmth of his palms grounding me in the moment. It wasn't without its challenges. The initial discomfort made me tense, but Ronald was attentive, constantly checking in with subtle movements and soothing touches. His patience made all the difference, and slowly I began to relax. What struck me most was how deeply connected I felt to him in those moments. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Every touch, every whispered reassurance was filled with care and intention. It was as if he was telling me, without words, how much he valued this, how much he valued me. His lips traveled lower, finding the hollow of my throat and then the curve of my collarbone. Each kiss felt deliberate, like he was taking his time to memorize every inch of me. When he reached my chest, he paused for a moment, his hands sliding up to rest gently on my sides. I could feel the heat of his breath against my skin, and it sent a wave of warmth coursing through me. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, and I could feel the solid strength of him under my fingertips. He moved slowly, savoring every moment, and I matched his pace, letting myself sink fully into the experience. The world outside the room faded away, leaving just us, wrapped in this cocoon of shared warmth and quiet intensity. At one point, he stopped and looked up at me, his eyes searching mine as if asking for permission to take the next step. I nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. He smiled. A soft, reassuring smile that made me feel completely safe and gently guided me to lie back. What followed was a delicate balance of tenderness and passion. He turned me around at one point, his hands steady and careful, and while there was a momentary discomfort, his touch remained gentle, his movements considerate. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, pausing to check in. I nodded again, my breath catching as I felt his hand stroke my back reassuringly. The initial tension melted away, replaced by a sense of connection that felt deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical aspect, it was the way he paid attention to every detail, the way he adjusted to my reactions, and the way he made me feel completely seen and valued. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a silent agreement that this wasn't just about pleasure, it was about trust, intimacy, and love. There was something indescribably intoxicating about the way Ronald moved, how effortlessly strong he was, but at the same time so controlled, so deliberate. It wasn't just physical strength, it was the quiet confidence in the way he held me, the way his hands guided me with a kind of assertiveness that made me feel both completely safe and undeniably exhilarated. I loved the way he pressed me into the bed, his body firm against mine, as though he was grounding me in the moment. His strength wasn't overbearing, it was the perfect balance of dominance and care. I could feel the weight of him, the warmth radiating through the thin barrier of our skin, and it sent shivers of anticipation down my spine. It wasn't just the sensation of it, though, it was the trust we built that made it so incredible. I knew he'd never push too far, that he was always attuned to me, always listening to the supple cues of my body and breath. He pinned my wrists above my head at one point, his grip firm but never painful, and the way his eyes met mine made my heart race. There was something so primal about it, yet it was layered with tenderness. I could feel my chest rising and falling rapidly, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the intensity of the moment washed over me. I couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh, more from sheer amazement than anything else, and Ronald smiled, that soft, crooked grin that always made me melt. But then, as if on some unspoken cue, the dynamic shifted. I don't even know exactly how it happened. We were moving so fluidly, so in sync, that it felt almost instinctive. One moment, we were tangled up in the soft sheets of the bed, and the next, we were on the floor, the cool hardwood pressing against my back as I pulled him down with me. I wasn't even sure why we moved. It was one of those spontaneous things that just felt right in the moment. The change in location added a new kind of excitement, like we were breaking all the rules, even though there were none to begin with. This time, I took the lead. I rolled us over so I was on top, my hands resting on his chest as I looked down at him. His eyes widened slightly, more amused than surprised, and I couldn't help but smirk. "Looks like the tables have turned," I teased, my voice light but edged with confidence. Ronald chuckled, his hands settling on my hips as he gave a small, playful squeeze. "I don't mind letting you take over," he said, his tone equally teasing. "Show me what you've got." That little challenge sparked something in me. There was a thrill in being the one in control, in deciding the pace and the rhythm. I leaned down, brushing my lips against his, slow and deliberate, before pulling back just enough to see his reaction. His breath hitched slightly, and I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that I could make him feel the same way he'd made me feel moments earlier, vulnerable in the best way. I trailed my lips along his jawline, down to his neck, savoring the way his body responded under my touch. I could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he resisted the urge to take back control, and it made me smile. "You're not used to this, are you?" I teased, letting my fingers trace lazy patterns along his chest. "Not at all," he admitted with a grin, his voice rough with emotion. "But I like it, and so I did." The floor wasn't as forgiving as the bed, but we hardly noticed. It was about the connection, the way we moved together like we were perfectly in sync, each of us attuned to the other's needs and reactions. There was a simplicity to it this time, a kind of raw honesty that made the moment feel even more intimate. I wasn't just leading. I was exploring, discovering what made him tick, what made him sigh or shiver or laugh. At one point, I pressed my hands firmly against his shoulders, holding him down in the same way he'd held me earlier, and the look in his eyes was a mix of surprise and admiration. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured, his tone laced with both humor and genuine respect. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in each other, the rest of the world fading away. It wasn't just about the physicality, it was about the way we trusted each other enough to let go, to be vulnerable, to explore and experiment without fear or hesitation. It was the kind of connection that didn't need words, though we filled the space with laughter and teasing anyway. Eventually, we ended up sprawled on the floor, our limbs tangled together, both of us breathless but utterly content. Ronald reached up to brush a strand of hair out of my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek as he looked at me with that familiar, steady gaze. "You're incredible," he said softly, and I knew he meant it, not just in the context of the moment, but in every way. "So are you," I replied, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his forehead. "But don't get used to me being in charge. I think I like it better when you're the one holding me down." Ronald laughed, the sound rich and full of life, and he pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me as though he never wanted to let go. "We'll find the perfect balance," he said, his voice a soft promise in the quiet of the room. And as I lay there in his embrace, the cool floor beneath us and the warmth of his body surrounding me, I couldn't help but think that we already had. The shift in our relationship wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow, natural progression that, looking back now, feels inevitable, like it was always meant to be this way. Ronald and I had always been close, the kind of best friends who could finish each other's sentences and make each other laugh with a single look. We shared everything: dreams, fears, late-night confessions about things we weren't ready to tell anyone else. But intimacy has a way of changing things. That night in the hotel felt like the tipping point, the moment when everything between us became undeniable. There was no awkwardness afterward, no second-guessing or awkward silence. Instead, there was this quiet understanding between us, a kind of peace that came from finally acknowledging something that had been building for so long. Ronald, who had always identified as straight, was the first to bring it up, not immediately, but a few days later, when we were hanging out at his apartment. We'd been talking about something completely unrelated, something trivial like where to order takeout, when he suddenly turned to me with this serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking about us," he said, his voice low but steady. I raised an eyebrow, trying to play it cool even though my heart was racing. "Yeah, what about us?" He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen a million times before. That night, it wasn't just a one-time thing for me. I don't know how to explain it, but being with you felt right, like more right than anything else has ever felt. I didn't know what to say at first. I'd always known how I felt about him. Those feelings had been simmering under the surface for months, maybe even years, but hearing him say it out loud felt surreal. "I'm not sure what it means," he continued, his eyes locked on mine. "I've never felt this way about a guy before, but with you, it's different. You're different." I couldn't help but smile. "You know, you're allowed to be a little confused. We don't have to ladle it right now. What matters is how we feel about each other." He nodded, and for the first time that night, his shoulders relaxed a little. "How do you feel about me?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I reached over, taking his hand in mine. "I feel like you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I'd be an idiot not to see where this could go." That was the beginning of us. It wasn't like we immediately started calling each other boyfriend or plastering it all over social media. In many ways, things stayed the same. We still hung out like we always did, cracking jokes and debating over movies. We still had the same inside jokes and shared history that had made us best friends in the first place. But there was something new between us, a quiet kind of intimacy that seeped into every moment we spent together. Ronald was still figuring things out, and I respected that. He wasn't the kind of guy to rush into anything without thinking it through, and I appreciated how honest he was with me about his feelings. "This is all new to me," he admitted one night as we were lying in bed, his arm draped over my waist, "but I've never been happier." And neither had I. Our intimacy deepened in ways I never expected. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was incredible in its own right. It was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. It was the way he'd brush his thumb across my cheek during quiet moments, or how he'd pull me close just because he could. But what made it so special was that we never lost the foundation of our friendship. Even now, with everything that's changed, he's still my best friend first and foremost. We still laugh until we're crying over dumb jokes. We still know exactly what the other is thinking without saying a word. And we still have each other's backs, no matter what. There's this incredible balance between us, this push and pull that makes everything feel effortless. Some days, he's the one taking the lead, guiding me with that quiet strength I've always loved about him. Other days, I'm the one who's in control, teasing him mercilessly until he's laughing so hard he can't breathe. And then there are the moments when we're just us, sitting on the couch in our sweats, sharing a pizza and binge-watching some ridiculous show, completely comfortable in the silence because we don't need words to fill the space between us. I never thought I'd end up here, in this kind of relationship with someone who started as my best friend. But now that I'm here, I can't imagine it any other way. Ronald is everything I've ever wanted and more. He's my rock, my partner, my favorite person in the world.